Hello and welcome to another session in the Issues and Debates module of Paper 3. We're looking at reductionism and holism. As you can see on the screen, we've got our spec links as well. We've got to understand the debates between the two and also levels of explanation in psychology as well as biological and environmental reductionism. So let's get a start with the basic key definitions of both reductionism and holism. If we look at reductionism, the belief that human behaviours is best explained by breaking it down into smaller constituent parts. Now, that might sound a little bit complex, but let's look at the word reductionism. I always say, get a big word like that, reduce it down to its most simplest form, is reduce. So really, this debate says, in order to understand behaviour, we need to reduce it into the smallest part possible. Please don't get this mixed up with determinism. Determinism says there's a specific cause, but this is kind of like going beyond determinism. It's saying, yes, there is a specific cause, but we want to find out exactly what it is. And that's what reductionism is. It's reducing it down to the most simplest cause that there is. Now, if you understand the concept of parasomny, which is based on the view that the simplest explanation is often the best, and that's what reductionism kind of looks at. It says, in order to truly understand behaviour, find the simplest explanation, or we reduce it down to the most simplest form, and therefore we can get the best explanation. And that's what reductionism is. It's about reducing it down. In essence, it really does support the idea of, a causal relationship. Here's the cause that stimulates a response. When it comes to holism, the other side of the debate, an argument or theory which proposes that it only makes sense to study an individual system rather than in constituent parts. Now, what that's saying is, if we're just looking at a particular part, we're looking it out of context. It means in order to understand human behavior, we need to look at the complexities of everything that's happening in that individual's life to understand what's happening. So within the holism and reductionist debate, it comes down whether you want to look for the simplest explanation or you want to look for a complex explanation between the two of them. The simplest explanation would seek to find a single cause. And that's why it's reductionism. Remember, it reduces it down. Whereas the most complex explanation, holism, will try to look at a complete picture. Looking at it as a whole. Holism, whole. It's looking at the whole. So it's really important that we understand not just the key definitions, but what each of these debates represent. So let's look at holism in a little bit more depth. Gestalt psychology that came out in the 1930s or thereabouts actually is holism. It says we cannot understand a singular component to define behaviour. It is really impossible to understand the complexities of human behaviour from one single component. They look at it as, in order to understand human behaviour, the whole being is greater than the sum of the parts. I like to look at the idea of baking a cake. Well, I like that old song, I knew you were coming, I would bake a cake, bake a cake. Okay, I've digressed, let me get back. Now, when you eat a cake, you don't go, that sugar tastes amazing, or what a fresh egg. You actually say, this cake is so light and fluffy. And really, this is holism. you don't look at a cake as a singular ingredient. You look at it as a complete unit, a sum of all its parts. So psychologists study the whole person to gain an understanding of all the factors that might influence behavior. So really, it's saying that human behavior is very complex, and we need to understand how all the key factors interlink and integrate with one another so that we can understand behavior. So holism uses several levels of explanation. So it will include biological, environmental, the social facts, a person's cognition, right? There are lots of factors that need to be taken into account. So holism is looking at the qualitative aspect in understanding human behavior. It's looking at it from the uniqueness of that individual rather than just a singular component. So we're going to look at an argument in favour of holism, a nice little bit of A of 3 here. It's always quite good when you're doing your evaluations that actually you put it forward as an argument in favour, because from a holistic point of view, you know, those psychologists like the Gestalt psychologists, they will actually see what one might regard as a limitation actually not as a limitation. They might see it as a strength, but it's an argument in favour, and we need to look at it as arguments against. So in red, that symbol's our point. Remember, make our point clear and precise. To understand certain social behaviours, it must be viewed in a holistic view. And that makes a lot of sense. If you had to understand the social interaction between people, we couldn't just look at it in accordance with perhaps a specific candidate gene. It might say, well, yeah, well, this is an influencing factor, but it's not giving us the whole picture or explaining to us why this is happening. So we've got a nice clear point, let's explain it. This means that the group dynamic needs to be viewed as a collective unit rather than at the level of the individual. So if we're looking at social interaction, we can't just look at one individual to understand the interaction. We've got to look at all the people within that social group to understand the dynamics. Now, here's a nice example. Sometimes you might discuss the reductionism versus holism debate. And then it goes comma, refer to one topic in your answer. Now, this is a good way to link it in, is by bringing that topic in from, remember, paper one's got lovely examples of research that you could use, and that will help you meet that criteria. So Assey's research into majority influence showed how an individual changes their behaviour in line with the rest of the group. Remember, we don't need to tell them all about Assey's study, we just need to talk about the premise of it. So we've made our point, that's clear and precise. We've explained what the point means. We've given some evidence, and this is linking to a topic. Now we want to elaborate. Elaborate means explain why this evidence links to the point. The role of majority influence, it must be studied in a group context to allow us to see the effects of the majority has on the individual. This social behaviour would not be understood if studied only at the level of the individual. So it's clearly explaining how that links to the point, how this piece of research does. So we've got a point, explain, evidence, elaborate. Let's finish off with our linking sentence. Remember, a linking sentence ties it back to the point and gives us a little mini conclusion. It's not about repeating the point again, because we've already got the point. It's about making that little mini conclusion. So by using a holistic approach, it will provide a complete understanding of the social behaviour. Just by simply saying it will provide a complete understanding, it allows us to link back and make a mini conclusion about social behaviour. So here we have a nicely developed argument in favour. Now, I'm not going to do all of these for you. Against, task, pause the video and look for an argument against. come on, the thing about holism, it doesn't really meet the criteria of the scientific argument. It is looking at the complexity, so therefore the subjectiveness. So it's going to give us qualitative data than quantitative data. So a nice one, come on, you can develop it. So let's move on. Reductionism we've defined before. Just like in determinism, we've got different types of determinism, we've got different types of reductionism. We're only going to focus on two: biological reductionism, so let's pull up some key points. Behavior has a biological origin. So that means we are looking for the simplest biological explanation, and it will be a specific biological element. Now, students get mixed up on this because when they talk about, sometimes they get reductionism and determinism mixed. So we might say genes can account for the behavior, but that's quite deterministic. And actually, it's not the simplest form. So looking at the simplest form, we want to look at something specific that can account for it. Now, I'm going to link this back to what we did at OCD. Well, I hope that's my example coming up. In psychopathology. In OCD, it's genetic. Yep, we know that's the cause, but we want to make it more specific. We've got the candidate gene, 5-HTI -D beta. This, remember, a candidate gene is one specific thing. So what we're doing here, we are reducing it down to the simplest form. If we have a faulty gene, it's going to affect serotonin transportation, and if we're not getting the serotonin, it actually is going to affect our mood. So therefore, we can perhaps explain why a person will have certain types of behaviors if they suffer from OCD. So can you see how we've reduced it down to its most simplest form? A specific gene. Now, I'm not teaching you anything new here. This is a gene that we looked at when we did the biological explanations of OCD. Another example could be a fault with decision making in OCD, and that could be reduced down, not sewn, down to abnormal functioning of the frontal lobes. Again, it's taking something complex, not reducing it down to the brain. We're looking at what specific area in the brain, and that's frontal lobes. Again, I'm not teaching you anything new from this knowledge by bringing in this evidence. What I'm doing is I'm using previous knowledge to help. Environmental reductionism, that should automatically jump into your head. Environmental reductionism is going to be the behaviorist approach. You know, it's the environment that influences us. So here we're breaking it down to the whole idea of stimulus response. We have a specific stimulus that causes a specific response. Again, simplest form. We're not looking at the complexities of the social situation. We're reducing it down to stimulus response. So again, like I just said, very much behaviorist. So for example, the formation of attachment. Stimulus is food, response is pleasure. Again, how can we say that we form attachment? Is because of food. Stimulus, response, pleasure, then that's associated to the mother. So a very simplistic explanation. Or development of a phobia. We have our stimulus, growling dog, response, fear. So very much your classical conditioning, learning through association. We break it down to the most simplest stimulus, which causes a specific response. Now, within this debate, we look at levels of explanation. And in here, the more complex the explanation, the less likely it is to be reductionist and more likely to be holistic. The more simple the explanation, the more likely it's going to be reductionist. Now, we'll keep on the idea of OCD. This means that there are several ways in which a phenomenon can be viewed within psychology. So we'll stick with OCD and we'll have a look at it there. Now, we've got different levels: social, cultural, psychological, physical, physiological level, and neurochemical level. Now, when we start at social cultural context, that means actually it's quite a complex area, and there could be lots of different factors: cultural, social interaction, socialization, all those factors. So here it's quite complex. And it is less likely to be reductionist because of the complexity of the explanation it's trying to use. Move on to psychological to understand the behavior. Now, here it's going to be quite complex as well, because when we look at it from a psychological level, as experienced of obsessive thoughts, you know, the complexities of the cognitive processes into having these obsessive thoughts to explain it's not a particular area, it could be the mediating thought processes. It is the different schemas that we have that could influence. So there could be a lot of possibilities. If we look at the physical level with regards to it, it's perhaps, if we're looking at hand washing, it's the sequences of hand washing, the muscles that are involved for this to occur. But so far we've gone from quite complex. It's still complex when we move on to the psychological, but perhaps is not. And as we moved down this list, we can see the arguments are becoming less complex. Because if we go right down to the neurochemical level, we could be looking at the idea of serotonin, one neurochemical. So really quite reductionist. And that's what we mean by levels of explanation. Each one of these levels is more reductionist than the one before. So the psychological is more reductionist than the social cultural. Whereas the neurochemical level is the most reductionist of them all, because it's narrowing it down to the most simplistic explanation. Now, reductionism. Again, we're looking for an argument in favor, an argument against, but I'm including a little task here for you to be doing. I want you to develop the appeal. Okay, point. A strength of reductionism is the fact that it is a key feature of science. That's what science wants, reductionism, so it can establish a causal relationship, cause and effect. So if we have a specific cause, so that means reducing it down to simple, right? Explain. This allows for specific operationalized variables to be studied in a controlled, observable manner. Just like I say, we can operationalize it, so we've got a specific IV to see what effects it will have on that DV. So we're reducing it right down. Now think about it. What evidence could you place here? See if you can get some evidence from something from paper 1 that will allow you to link to these operationalized variables. Come on, Pavlov's dogs is a great example here, right? Where we have the idea operationalized food, right, and salivation, and we link in the bell. So a nice one. What this does, it's gaining validity and reliability, getting tongue-tied, reliable data to give psychology the accreditation it commands. So because it gives us reliable, because it's replicable, that means we can test it over and over. It gives us then validity in what we're trying to say. Now, an argument against, and you can finish off this, again, point, explain, evidence, elaborate, link. What's present in this? And I'll let you figure it out yourself. Reductionism does not allow for an explanation within the social context in which behavior has occurred. E.g., waving your hand. It will identify that it is a particular muscle performing the function, but it's not telling us why the person is waving. This means that reductionist explanations can only explain part of an explanation and not the whole explanation. So what's missing in the appeal? I'll let you find out that. But what I want to really identify here is one of these arguments in favor of reductionism is actually the argument against holism. The argument against reductionism is actually the argument in favor of holism. So we can clearly see that they're quite different. Holism is looking at the uniqueness of that individual. And a lot of the time it's gaining the qualitative, where reductionism is simplifying it to the most simplest form and very much in favor of the scientific method. Right, so a nice little recap on this debate. Remember, if you have any questions, you know where I am. Send me an email or pop in and see me in class. and we can have a discussion further. So take care and study well. Bye.